This week on The Truth of It, we talk God and Dr. Jordan Peterson, Martina Navratilova and the men winning women's sports, Donald Trump on abortion, and Cardinal George Pell. Welcome to The Truth of It, ACL's weekly newscast on politics and current events to cut through the fake news and bring you what it says on the tin, which is the truth of it. And we start today with Dr. Jordan Peterson. Nothing like piggybacking off another man's fame. But I actually have some things that I want to observe about him that I trust will be helpful. But for those of you who have not heard very much about Dr. Peterson, he is a lecturer, he is a psychologist, specifically he's the professor of psychology at the University of Toronto in Canada. And he shot to fame a few years ago when he refused a university edict that staff refer to students by their preferred gender pronouns. He said that he would not be compelled concerning what he must say, especially by those who are driven by Marxist motives. And of course he has been an outspoken critic of one of the ideas that is swirling around in our Western society at the moment called cultural Marxism. But he has become a global phenomenon since then. In fact, he's lectured in over 100 cities to more than 250,000 people in the last 12 months since he launched 12 Rules for Life. His recent tour of Australia and New Zealand has so far attracted 43,000 people, which is pretty big. But actually, as I wrote that stat down, it occurred to me that a man who has not had the same prominence in mainstream circles is Franklin Graham, and he recently did a tour just of Australia, not New Zealand, and he attracted roughly 60,000 people, and he actually went to fewer cities than Jordan Peterson. For example, he never went to Canberra. But that to one side, we have the phenomenon known as Jordan Peterson, which is a global phenomenon, and he is particularly well known, well received amongst younger people, especially amongst younger men. And you know, his stated purpose, and he said this recently, is a message of meaning, which of course rubs up against the meaninglessness of the kind of worldview into which so many in their 20s and 30s have been inducted, the postmodern or postmodern-ish worldview of the modern West. But you know, I've been to one of his lectures in Sydney, and I would say also a quest for truth. He looks for truth, and he looks to build up meaning. He tears down that house of cards, which is a postmodern worldview, and he seeks to rebuild something substantial with a stronger foundation in its place. And there's been much conjecture about Dr. Peterson's view of Christianity and his view of God. Of course, he actually lectures the Bible in some of his lectures that he posts online, and he is well liked by many Christians because he is sympathetic towards so many Christian principles. And you know, the question of God actually came up in his appearance on ABC's Q&A on Monday night. He was invited on as one of the panelists, and of course ABC as a result saw their highest ratings so far this year, which is completely unsurprising. But you know, one of the questions asked the panel if they believe in God, and I thought the answers were very interesting. All of the panelists made a concession to some degree of the reality of God. Catherine McGregor answered first, and Catherine McGregor is a transgender person born a man. And Catherine said, "I do believe, and I base that on experience. There was what I can only describe as a phenomenon in response to a very desperate prayer when I was dying in delirium tremens, and I've not had a drink since the day I uttered that prayer." That's, of course, withdrawal from alcoholism, from alcohol as an alcoholic. "I've been welcome in some Anglican communities, and I go there because I like the ritual. But without beating my breast in the public square, I pray daily. I pray in the morning upon waking. I pray at intervals throughout the day, and I try to meditate." That from Catherine McGregor. Van Badham, who was also on the panel, said, "I'm a Christian, very devout, and a Marxist. Yes, both at the same time. Anyway, I absolutely believe in God, and my faith sustains me through darkness. My faith gives me meaning," is what Van Badham said. Alex Hawke, who is the Special Minister of State, the federal member for Mitchell, said, "I believe in God. I am a Protestant by tradition," and then went on to say, "One of the great successes of the West was that we separated the church and the state, and religion is a private matter." Okay. I'm not sure that's the meaning of separation of church and state. But anyway, Terry Butler, federal member for Griffith, Kevin Rudd's former seat, says, "I'm an agnostic. I've always been agnostic. I've always identified that way. And Terry Butler went on to say, well, you don't have to be a Christian to believe in human dignity and human worth and morals and so on. You don't have to believe in God, actually, is what she said. I dispute that, but there you go. And then Dr. Jordan Peterson answered last, and he gave a very oblique and sort of not clear answer at all. But this is one of the things that he said in his answer. He said, I act as if God exists and that I'm terrified he might. I act in the manner of a person who is obsessed with religious matters. It's interesting, you know, I was looking on social media and things like that, and a lot of people were really thrilled that the entire panel made some concession as to the existence of God. And I do think that there's something in it insofar as it represents potentially a new era in Western culture. There was a time in which such admissions you would have thought wouldn't have been so welcome in a crowd like the ABC Q&A crowd, but they in fact were not unwelcoming. In fact, I'd say somewhat in the opposite direction of these declarations. But you know, there's a sobering verse, James chapter 2 verse 19, which says this. It says, you believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and tremble. You see, the better question is not whether or not I believe in God or whether or not a person believes in God. The better question is, who is God? It's the question asked that Jesus asked of Simon Peter, who said, who do you say that I am? And you know, that question, either of those questions, who is Jesus Christ? Who is God? That would have actually got a very different and an extremely revealing answer from each of the panelists on Monday night. Because you see, belief in God may be coming back in vogue. The audience certainly welcomed the response, but the God that is increasingly worshipped today is not God as you and I instinctively think about him necessarily. I think, you know, he has a name. It's a name that I hear in conversations. It's a name that I hear in debates. It's a name that I hear as I talk to people about Christianity and God and things like that. And you've probably heard his name too. And his name is something like this. It is God to me. That's what people say. They say, God to me is like this, or does that, or is this kind of being, or is that kind of being, or comes to me in this experience, or whatever. Our views of God are so often framed entirely in terms of what we find helpful, what we find comforting, what we find reasonable, what we find to be in accordance with what we think and feel, whether God's private, not public. You know, as one of the panelists said, whether God is not so much Lord of your life that he pushes the Marxism out of your worldview, or God who fits in with my experience, the things that I think that I've encountered. God always in a box, in my box, always God to me. And you know, Jesus said something chilling. This is a hard business, by the way, but I think really important to ask these questions these days. Jesus said something very chilling in Matthew chapter 7 during the Sermon on the Mount. He actually said, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. See, this is the point. He says many people are going to say, because there is a day coming when we'll see him. Many people are going to say, Lord, I know you. And the response is going to be, well, no, you don't. Doubtless you know something. Doubtless you may even know someone. But the something that you know, the someone that you know, even if very real to you, actually wasn't me. Who do you say that I am? That's the key question. Who is Jesus? Who is God? That's the question that we all have to answer, and that we will all answer one day. And you know, it's a challenge to me, because I'm reminded that we must be scrupulous about always submitting to the truth that is revealed to us, not falling into the trap of designing something else, a Christ who is actually the Christ that I've imagined, God who is actually the God who I have imagined, stepping outside of the scope of the revelation that God has given us of himself. It requires serious and sober reflection, and that's the question that it's much harder to get Dr. Jordan Peterson to answer. Who is Jesus? Who is God really? deep in his philosophies, deep in his thinking. There are oblique answers to those questions, but they're not necessarily the one that Peter gave. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Well, they're definitely not the one that Peter gave. But before I move on from this subject, I want to turn back more generally to Dr. Jordan Peterson, because some have asked me for my views on him. And that's a tough question because, I mean, I've got to be realistic. He's infinitely more brilliant than I am, infinitely more experienced, more thoroughly knowledgeable. It's a stupid idea to even make any sense of comparison at all. But here's what I can figure out in simple terms, which is how I try and assess things. I do try and get to the core of issues and think them through. And I've listened very hard to what he says, and I've read some of his materials. And, I have found that I've learned so much from him on a particular point. I've learned so much from him on his cultural analysis. I really have, in terms of his understanding, dissecting, describing the prevailing worldview in Western society right now. He's actually able to tell, especially millennials, younger people, about the world that they live in and the world that they're encountering in such a way that makes them go, oh my goodness, yes, that is absolutely right. This guy understands, this guy gets me, like people like him don't usually understand the world that I'm in. He's brilliant at that. I've learned a lot from him on worldview analysis, on philosophical analysis, the thought patterns of our time. But the question is, for me, his analysis is great, I've learned a lot, but what of his gospel? Because that's what he does. He analyzes the worldview. He kind of shows how empty it is, actually, the prevailing worldview that's emerging amongst millennials in our time. But what's his gospel? What's his solution? What's the truth that he wants to build up in its place? And I attended one of his lectures in Sydney. In fact, it was on his last tour when he came out here last year. And he opened by declaring quite openly that his was a quest for truth. He was searching for the truth. He said, I want to find bedrock. I want to drill all the way through till I hit rock bottom and find substance, something to stand on, something to rely on, a truth quest. Then he opened with that, and then he lectured for 2 hours. And the room hung on his every word. I looked around me at a few junctures, and people were leaning forward, listening, absolutely hanging on what he was saying. And that was incredible. And it's testament, I think, to how hollowed out we have become through vacuous, postmodernist type thinking that says that there is no substantial truth. To make a claim that you know truth is arrogant. It's not about telling people truth. It's about finding out what they feel about things and getting their responses on things. That's what education has done these days, and that's where it's headed. Or telling people that they can be anything they want to be and whomever they want to be, and there's no strictures or right and wrong. And we're seeing the pretty toxic fruits of that at the moment. And I looked around, and in the first tour, and I don't think that was so much the case this time, but in the first tour, most of the people were men, sort of guys in their 30s, 20s. And I looked around and I thought, yeah, here's a generation that's been sort of raised on a diet of binge watching Netflix and surfing YouTube and pornography and all of these things that are just vacuous and dissipation. And here are guys, and I talked to some of them that were sitting around me in their early 30s, realizing how that they've got a meaningless life. Many of them say to Dr. Peterson, you saved my life, you gave me meaning. And that's exactly what these guys were saying. Oh, Dr. Peterson has helped me to find meaning in life. It's incredible to see the emptiness of that which this worldview is leaving young people. And to see someone like Dr. Peterson say, well, I'm going to try and find the truth. And my goodness, don't they flock to him. But after I went to his talk, I wrote a blog, which in my hotel, and I put it up on the internet last year, and it was republished in an edited form yesterday in response to his Q&A appearance. So look at it at ACL website when you get a chance. So I'm going to read part of it, which captures my, I think, general reflection. It says, listening carefully to Peterson, I couldn't help thinking of the Apostle Paul's sermon to the Athenians on Mars Hill in Acts 17. Because they too, those Athenian philosophers, sought bedrock. They were the great Greek philosophers, the men who Paul addressed. These were engaged in one of the greatest quests for truth and ultimate meaning. Our Western cultural heritage bears witness to their work even today. But they hadn't gone deep enough. Theirs was a drilling expedition that had stopped too soon. Remember, Peterson opened with saying, I'm looking for that bedrock to drill down to. Paul saw as he walked through their city idols and altars to many gods. So many of these represented realities that these people had discovered. Gods, for example, who imparted art and music, fertility, victory in battle, gods of the sea, of fire, of beauty, and so forth. But surely there is something even greater that lies yet behind all of those things. And actually the history of Greek thought, I think I'm right in saying, shows that they were looking for those things that lay behind all of that. Peterson's similar. The foundations upon which he relies are the archetypes of psychological theory. They're said to be deep, enduring truths held in the collective unconscious of societies throughout the ages. They find expression in narratives and religions and social norms and psychological realities and this kind of thing. They exist and have always existed because they are true, though we often know not how or why. In his lectures, the Bible is held up as a text in which we find the paramount expression of some of these archetypes. Jesus, for example, says Peterson, shows us this deep truth, this archetypal truth, that if we bear the burden of our own vulnerability to hardship and injustice willingly and without complaint, then we will be able to transcend it. Zion, the heavenly city on a hill, tells us this truth, that we can struggle under the weighty burdens of our human brokenness in a way that carries us upwards until we reach a place where there will be no more. Or the Sermon on the Mount. It bears witness to this truth, that no matter the pain and difficulty of our own circumstances, no matter our lack of privilege, moral character is attainable by all. That's why he calls the Bible both myth and true. It's a myth that bears witness to the truths of the archetypes. But surely there is something greater than the archetypes. The realities of our world are not true because they spring from Greek myth or even from archetypes that may be expressed by those myths and other sources like the Bible. As Paul once said, these things are true because of God, who is yet unknown to Peterson and so many of his disciples, the true and living God, as Paul said at Mars Hill, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth. God who made the bedrock truth which lies behind the archetypes, the one in whom we live and move and have our being, said Paul as well, by whom we can actually become transformed to the people of character that Peterson would have his followers become, who gives us the indwelling power to do that. In many ways, I felt like I was sitting in a modern-day Areopagus, which is where the sermon was delivered. Whilst listening to Peterson, the great philosopher stood before us, leading us on our quest for truth and meaning. An audience made hungry by hollowed-out postmodern secularism hangs on every word. Questions follow. It would have been fitting had there been an altar to an unknown God in the corner, as there was in Athens. The room doesn't know it, but he is the answer to all of their questions, those they've asked and those that they don't even know. He is the bedrock that they seek, the Logos by whom all things have been made, who is the light and life of men. There is a hungry, needy, confused generation growing up in Australia. The Dr. Jordan Petersons of this world are feeding them something, but I can't help thinking, why not the church? If it is a message of truth and meaning that we crave, then increasingly this unknown God, but revealed in the pages of Scripture, is the answer, because he is true and he has given all things their meaning. I'm going to turn now to Martina Navratilova and her comments on men who are winning women's sports. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that's been going on for a little while now. For example, on Sunday, the Washington Times carried the headline, "Transgender sprinters finished second at Connecticut Girls Indoor Track Championships." In fact, the winner of that race set a new state record. And this comes off the back of an opinion piece by the elite tennis player who I just referenced, Martina Navratilova, who's actually historically also a gay rights activist. And she wrote this: "A man can decide to become a female, take hormones if required by whatever sporting organisation is concerned, win everything in sight, and perhaps earn a small fortune, and then reverse his decision and go back to making babies if he so desires. It's insane and it's cheating. I'm happy to address a transgender woman in whatever form she prefers, but I would not be happy to compete against her. It would not be fair. Hundreds of athletes who have changed gender by declaration and limited hormone treatment have already achieved honours as women that are beyond their capabilities as men, especially in sports in which power rather than skill is paramount. Well, why would she say that? Well, she wrote this opinion piece because it is an increasing issue. She actually references there that hundreds of athletes have changed their gender in order to compete, well, I mean, not in order to, but and have then competed in women's competitions as biological men. Or you could take some specific examples like Rachel McKinnon, a Canadian women's track cyclist born male. McKinnon won the World Championship sprint event, and in response actually to a photograph of the podium in which McKinnon was in first place, and then you had the second and third, and McKinnon's size was so much greater and bulk was so much greater than the second and third places that there was a lot of abuse actually levelled at McKinnon on the internet. Or there's example of Michelle Demarisk, a women's Canadian mountain biker, also born a male, won the national title in British Columbia. And the woman who came second to Demarisk also prompted controversy by wearing a t-shirt that said 100% pure woman champ. So again, controversy. Or you could look at weightlifter Laurel Hubbard, born a man. Laurel was the heaviest competitor in the 90 kilo plus category at 132 kilograms, won the Australian International Open in Melbourne in 2017. Or Hannah Mounsey, that was in the news here in Australia for a while, making a foray into women's AFL. Recently that was met with much controversy because he played men's handball prior to transitioning. And so we ask, well, what are the rules? Why is this allowed to happen? Well, the International Olympic Committee has relied on testing and measuring testosterone levels, and that is, in fact, the common method that is used. And for a man to compete in women's sports, his testosterone levels must remain below 10 nanomoles per litre for at least 1 year before competing. But see, Navratilova addresses that in her column, says simply reducing hormone levels, prescription most sports have adopted, does not solve the problem. A man builds up muscle and bone density as well as a greater number of oxygen-carrying red blood cells from childhood. Training increases the discrepancy. Indeed, if a male were to change gender in such a way as to eliminate any accumulated advantage, he would have to begin hormone treatment before puberty. For me, that is unthinkable, although actually the push to begin hormone treatment before puberty is certainly well and truly on. But there you have it. And Professor Alison Heather from Otago University points out that male to female transgender athletes can benefit from greater body size, muscle mass, lung capacity, and heart size, for starters. Now, that's all really obvious. We don't need the research papers, we don't need the opinion piece, and we don't need the professor at the Otago University to say that, because it's just intuitive. And you only need to look at a photograph of many of these podiums where there is a biological male on the top place to see just the size difference, the mass difference between the athletes. And for those who are still naysayers, ask the question, why is it that there are no athletes with very high estrogen levels who are dominating male competitions? This is all a one-way street. This only goes in one direction, and there's a reason for that. And it is because there's an unfair advantage simply by virtue of the fact that these are biological men. And the simple truth is this, and I see it here, I've actually seen it quite a few places. I've seen it in a number of manifestations. This is perhaps one of the greatest. The transgender phenomenon is anti-women. Now, many people in the movement don't believe that they're anti-women and don't manifest anti-women tendencies, but the fact simply is that the effect of this movement is anti-women, whether intended or not. Whether it's the loss of women's bathrooms, whether it's the unfairness introduced into women's sports, as we've just discussed, the compromising of women's only prisons, women's shelters, women's gyms. The CEO of Women Speak Tasmania, which is a feminist organisation in Tasmania, said that they're aware of numerous cases of many things going wrong in this realm, including biological men gaining access to women's domestic violence shelters so that women who are seeking refuge have gone in there and actually been assaulted in the shelter by biological men who have gained access by identifying as trans. This is fundamentally anti-women. It doesn't work. When you get something wrong like this, it must yield toxic fruit. It can only bring about pain. See, I discussed last week the fact that all of this is going to continue. Now, last week we talked about the fact that they're trying to implant wombs into biological men now so they can have babies. So it's going to continue because Romans 1 is very clear. Once you say that God is dead, as the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, you will say what he said next, which is, if there is a God, how can I bear not to be that God? And that's what Romans 1 says. It says they worship and serve creature rather than creator, having said and that God is not real and having suppressed the truth about God. Go read it for yourself. But in particular, he says it's not just that people will take on that role of serving themselves as the highest and greatest, but they will actually take to themselves something which belonged exclusively to God, which was his role as creator God. And they will actually then say, well, no, we decide what is right and what is wrong. Not God creator, we are the creators now. We decide what is normal, natural and healthy in terms of sexual behaviour and things like this. And he actually gives that example in Romans 1. Or we even decide what is male and what is female. We're the creators now, right? But here's the thing, and it's seen here and it'll be seen many times more. The universe that we create doesn't stem from God's perfect and all-wise standard. The universe that we create finds its origin and finds its idea in the human heart. And Scripture very wisely teaches from start to finish, again and again and again. Jesus himself said it in blistering terms, that the human heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. The human heart is corrupted in its very core. And that which is corrupt can never produce that which is good and right. Corruption only produces corruption. And so, if we try to remodel the universe in our image, there will be pain. It won't work. People will suffer, and we will see corruption on the outside in society. So, we need to put down the tools and say we can't fake being creator anymore. That's God's job. And we need to get on with the business of actually being creatures and submitting to his perfect and all-wise lordship over creation. Now I'm going to turn to some good news, actually, believe it or not. Donald Trump and abortion. We know that the pro-life movement in the United States has been making progress for quite some time, and a lot of progress, actually. And the federal government in the US, under the Trump administration, has actually come a step closer to ending taxpayer funding for abortions. It was on Friday that Donald Trump said for decades American taxpayers have been wrongfully forced to subsidize the abortion industry. And, well, let's face it, that's very weird to hear that from any government in the world. Very weird indeed. The Trump administration has introduced changes to a federal program which is called Title X, which gives funding to low-income Americans for family planning services. And one beneficiary of those Title X funds from the federal government was Planned Parenthood. Now, Planned Parenthood is America's largest provider of abortions. They do 332,000 abortions nationally every year, and they were also the subject of that explosive undercover investigation with all the videotapes produced by a guy called David DeLayden, which exposed the fact that they were illegally selling the body parts of aborted babies to the biotech industry, which was just shocking. And the fact that they even still exist is mind-bending and shows the stranglehold that the abortion industry has on the culture in the US and the West in general. But Planned Parenthood, under these changes, will be stripped of $60 million in federal funds. So that is truly fantastic news, and that's because Title X funds are no longer permitted for providers that refer for abortions or perform abortions anywhere on site. The March for Life president, Gene Mancini, said the following, and by the way, the March for Life is the largest human rights demonstration in the world, and if you haven't heard of it, just look it up online, watch the videos of just how massive that is in Washington, D.C. every year, campaigning for an end to abortion. But the president of the March for Life said, "Today, the Trump administration took an imperative first step in the right direction by preventing Title X funds from being misused by those who promote and profit from abortion. Abortion is not healthcare. Yet for decades, the federal government has voluntarily supported abortion by subsidizing the industry with hundreds of millions of tax dollars every year." So this is just a start. But the rules that permitted those Title X funds to go to abortion providers were actually introduced during Bill Clinton's presidency. And now that money will be redirected to women's health centres, including pro-life service providers. And you know, there's a lot of things I could say about the abortion issue, but something just fresh that I discovered the other day, which I might share, was from Isaiah chapter 28. Someone posted this on Facebook in response to the abortion issue more generally, and I picked it up, so I'm grateful to them. This guy was commenting on some of the madness that we're now seeing coming out of the US pro-abortion camp as they feel the pressure under the Trump administration, and indeed as they feel significant pressure from the advances of the pro-life movement. They've done a whole lot of pretty bad things. You take the hashtag Shout Your Abortion campaign, where they decided to normalise and destigmatise abortion by getting women who have had abortions to proudly and loudly proclaim the fact that they've aborted their child online, through social media and publicly. I mean, there was even a time there where a couple of videos came out of women undergoing abortions live and smiling and talking about it and just parading what they were doing. The Shout Your Abortion thing is very real and very sick. Or the protesters recently who acted out a brutal scene in broad daylight in New York City of Jesus being aborted as he was birthed from the Virgin Mary. It's just blasphemous and disgusting. Fake blood and all, just gross. Or the activists who this week claimed that abortions should be celebrated like baby showers. I could go on. It's sick, it's depraved, and this is getting louder and louder in the US, and perhaps under pressure, some of the truth that underlies the pro-choice movement is coming to the surface. And I've often wondered, just how dark the abortion issue is and the madness of it, the way babies are killed so readily, and the way that when you try and stop it, or when you raise the issue, the anger and the venom that it promotes, and the depth of feeling about this by those who say that you cannot say that it is wrong to kill a baby. I mean, just walk into a room in any political scene and mention abortion and watch the fireworks. It's incredible. But it is every bit as dark as we think it is, I reckon. Because in Isaiah 28:15 it says this. It says, "We've made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have made a pact. Therefore, when the overflowing scourge passes through, it will not reach us when it passes by. For we have made falsehood our refuge, and we have concealed ourselves with deception." It's amazing, isn't it? The idea that people would make a covenant, would draw alongside with and commit themselves to death itself, and would hide behind the lie and the deception that it's a good thing and they will not be judged for it. There it is in Scripture all along. It's a timeless phenomenon. It is what people do when we as a society go astray. Dark times indeed. And I would really love to see real progress made on the pro-life issue in Australia. I see the goals that are being kicked in the US at the moment, and my goodness, it's a long and brutal and difficult fight that they've got. They've been going for years, but you see progress, bit by bit, tiny bit at a time, and you think, wow, I just wish we could have some of that progress here. In fact, we've gone backwards in recent years. And I think it's possible. I think as we build the movement, and I think as we get more and more people rallying around these important issues, as we learn to be more activist-minded in our political landscape, as others who oppose good moral values have done for years, I just think that we've got the numbers, we've got the base, and we've got the opportunity, by God's grace, to make progress on this. Something I'd really like to commit to in the next few years. I'm going to finish on a bit of a low note, actually. Usually I try and finish on a high note. Probably would have normally put the Trump issue at the end, the abortion issue. The low note is what we've all heard and know by now, which is that Cardinal George Pell has been found guilty of historic child sexual abuse. Now, I'm really not going to say much about this. I don't feel that it would be right. There's an appeal still to run. I'd like to wait for that process to exhaust. But whilst this is actually in the forefront of our minds, and I I am really saddened by it. I'm really saddened by all that it represents. And so it is on our mind, it is in the media. And so it's a good reminder to us that I think we should probably take this opportunity to pray about the issues. We should pray for victims. Pray for victims of child sexual abuse. Pray especially for the fact that they have potentially been alienated from God by the sins of men. And that is horrific. Pray for their healing and so on. Pray also for justice to be done in this case. Whatever the outcome of the appeal, pray for justice. That's what we want. Not to be absolutely committed to one view or the other of guilt or innocence or whatever, but to pray for justice. That's the most important thing. Also pray that the truth would prevail in this matter and in all of this entire matter in general, that it would prevail and continue to prevail. But I think also let's pray what Jesus instructed us to pray in the Lord's Prayer. One of the lines in that prayer is, "Hallowed be thy name." And really the saddest of things about this, is it right to say the saddest? Yeah, really sad, tragic aspect of this is that the name of Christ has been brought into spectacular disrepute over the last few years by the ongoing revelations of child sexual abuse. So pray that prayer. Pray that somehow, through all of this, the truth of who God is, that the holy nature of his name would be restored and resurrected and acknowledged as such in Australia. Well, on that note, we finish, and that was once again the truth of it.